Good day. We will be presenting what drives successors to adopt social and environmentally responsible practices. Analyzing family business successors.
To start, family businesses can be considered as the backbone of the Philippine economy since 80% of the active businesses are family owned and controlled. With that said, it is essential for these businesses to implement sustainability since they have the most impact on society. Due to changing times, consumers are now aware about their and the business's impact on society, which increases the need for these businesses to adapt and do their part in nation building. Numerous discussions have been done in relation to business continuation. However, successors' intent to adopt sustainable business practices is often overlooked. Given all these, here are the research questions for our study. The first one is, what factors drive successors' intent to adopt sustainable business practices? It is a supplementary question. Do certain factors have stronger weight in terms of driving successors' intent to adopt sustainable business practices? And for the second research question, do future successors have the intention and willingness to adopt sustainable business practices in the family business?
To address the problem stated, the following are the objectives of this research. First would be to identify the factors that contribute to driving successors' intent to adopt sustainable business practices. And the second would be to determine the relative significance of the identified factors in the decision-making processes of successors.
Cruz and Thornton reported that around 80% of the businesses in the Philippines are family owned or controlled. It justifies the importance of understanding how family businesses contribute to various factors such as the global economy, development, and environmental preservation. According to Damas and Gergod, sustainability practices are the ways that work towards a positive long-term impact for all stakeholders inside and outside the organization. Businesses are encouraged to implement these practices to remain competitive and to reduce their negative impact on the environment. Stewart stated that a successor refers to the chosen individual to inherit the business in the future. The transfer of power from the previous to the next generation is not limited to the replacement of position, given that it mainly focuses on the changes made by the successor and the management, relationships, and other related factors.
This study used two theories, namely theory of planned behavior and social cognitive theory. The theory of planned behavior, which was developed by Ashzen, implies that three independent variables, namely attitude, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control, affects the person's intention, which then affects the person's behavior. For this study, we will be focusing on its two classic variables, which are attitude and subjective norms. Attitude is concerned with the individual's subjective evaluation towards a specific behavior, whether this will be enjoyable or beneficial, while subjective norms is focused on the social pressure that an individual gets from their incumbents on whether or not the behavior should be performed or whether their incumbents also perform it.
This study is also based on Bandura's social cognitive theory, which entails that learning is done through the reciprocal interaction between the person, environment, and behavior. It analyzes how individuals acquire their behavior through the influence of social environment. We will be focusing on its two classic variables, which are desirability and outcome expectations. Desirability refers to a person's motivation to succeed in a future course of action, while outcome expectations deals with the person's anticipated results before engaging in a particular action. For both under the theory of planned behavior and social cognitive theory, perceived behavioral control and self-efficacy were combined as several studies mention its similarities. It refers to the level of control over conducting a certain action and the evaluation of one's abilities to achieve a certain objective.
The study was conducted under the general vicinity of Metro Manila, specifically targeting the LSU students as its main respondents. The La Salle University students were chosen not only for accessibility and convenience, but it was also due to the high concentration of business successors. The proponents utilized the framework of Creswell, which is the convergent parallel mix method. We have also surveyed a total of 107 respondents and interviewed 11 individuals. Questions from the interview and survey were based on Bandura's social cognitive theory and Adjussen's theory of planned behavior. Now, for the succeeding sections, we will be discussing the quantitative results of the study, starting off with the descriptive statistics. As seen from the descriptive statistics table, median and mode scores are only within the range of 4 and 5. This is assuring since it can be deduced that a significant number of respondents value sustainability. The negative skewness also demonstrates that majority of the respondents are within the agree and strongly agree region of the Likert scale.
As previously mentioned, the gathered data will first be put through a reliability and correlation analysis in order to determine the data's statistical reliability and significance respectively before conducting a multiple linear regression analysis. Presented are the results from the reliability analysis. Basing on the Cronbach's alpha scores, it can be concluded that all the variables are statistically reliable as they all exceeded the zero point 0.7 minimum score for a variable to be considered reliable for the research. The closest variable to not meeting the minimum score would be outcome expectations, but it still clearly surpassed the threshold. Of note is that subjective norms is deemed to be the variable with the strongest statistical reliability with a Cronbach's alpha score of 0.899. After the reliability analysis, the correlation analysis is conducted with the results presented here. With all the variables having a p-value less than 0.001, it can be concluded that all the variables presented are statistically significant, with desire having the strongest correlation to the dependent variable with a Pearson's R score of 0.801. Additionally, all the independent variables are presumed to have a positive relationship with the dependent variable as referenced by all of their positive Pearson's R scores. Given that the data gathered has been deemed to be both statistically reliable and significant, the mean scores of the variables are then used to conduct a multiple linear regression analysis. Some of the findings from the results are as follows. First, with an adjusted R squared of 0.72, it can be concluded that the 5 variables utilized account for around 72% of the variance when determining successor intent in adopting sustainable business practices. Next, with the overall model having a p-value of less than 0.001, the regression analysis produced is indeed statistically significant. Next, with a standard estimate score of 0.5768, it can be concluded that desire is the strongest and greatest contributor when analyzing the dependent variable. Lastly, it can be concluded that outcome expectations and the combined perceived behavioral control and self-efficacy variables have little to no significant effect on a successor's intent to implement sustainable practices in their respective family businesses. This is justified with two key results from the regression analysis. With 0 falling in between the upper and lower limits of both variables and having respective p-value scores greater than 0.05, the two variables can be disregarded when trying to consider what predicts successors' intent.
For the following section, we will be discussing the qualitative results of the study, starting off with the theory of planned behavior. For the variable of attitude, successors think positively about the behavior and express that it is a practice that needs to be done by businesses. As mentioned by one successor, it is primarily an expense, but it is a necessary one, while others mention its long-term benefits. Most successors also agree that the advantages of adopting sustainable business practices will outweigh its disadvantages because although it is costly, it takes more effort, and it needs a lot of time to implement, they would be able to tackle the triple bottom line, and it ensures the longevity of the business. Successors also express that they like the idea of it and view it as a really good cause. Meanwhile, for the variable of subjective norms, most successors express that their incumbents do not expect them to implement sustainable business practices because the idea of it was not introduced and emphasized to them when they first started their business. As mentioned by one successor, they are used to doing the traditional practices and are set in their current processes as long as they are still able to sell and gain profit. However, a few successors are encouraged because their current practices are outdated and there is a need for new ways. Nonetheless, most of the successors think that their incumbents will approve of their decision to adopt the practices and that their incumbents will think that it will be a good idea to do so, given that the successors are able to clearly present the idea to them and justify that these processes will not put the business down and will be beneficial not only to them but also to the different stakeholders.
Moving on to the social cognitive theory, for desirability, successors want to emulate sustainable practices and they are open to learning from other businesses. One successor also mentioned researching other businesses for their sustainable practices. They are also aware of their purpose of giving back to the community by keeping the employees happy and safe and ensuring that the business is not negatively affecting the planet. Successors also want to shift to a modernized and sustainable business operations, as well as pioneer new sustainable practices, since it would provide convenience and pass on to the next generation. For outcome expectations, successors would gain self fulfillment once successfully made the business sustainably better, as well as being able to make a difference and give back to the community. For job related expectations, successors prefer more recognition of the sustainable practices to motivate others to do the same. They also expect that sustainable practices would help the business attract more customers.
For perceived behavioral control and self efficacy, successors are moderately confident, rating themselves 5 to 9 out of 10, but successors believe that it is possible to adopt sustainable practices once they exert full effort. Their educational background introduced them to the idea of sustainable practices, but learned more through the people they met and worked with, the seminars they attended, and through research. They share which skills are needed to adopt sustainable practices such as perseverance, creativity, and integrity. Successors also believe that it is necessary to properly research fitting sustainable practices for their line of business and consult with experts who can help implement the practices.
Both desire and intention contribute a positive effect towards an individual's motivation to conduct a certain behavior. However, there is a thin line that separates the two concepts. Desire refers to the attraction to conduct a certain behavior that commences during the start of the decision making. In the reasoning process, an individual would arrive at the formulation of intent, the next step to proceed with the action. The qualitative analysis shows that successors have a high desire to adopt sustainable practices, but it does not imply whether they would implement them. Nevertheless, there is higher possibility that successor would formulate their desire to intent. Moreover, successors show the desire to reduce the dependency on plastic and focus on the benefit of society. The common answer to their preliminary idea of sustainable practices to implement was to stop the usage of single use plastic and shift to a sustainable local packaging. Once the successor concludes that one would be capable of action, the desire then would turn into an intention. Otherwise, it would only retain as a desire to perform the action, while no formulation to act on that desire was done. It is evident that desire serves as a fundamental element in the formulation of successors' intent to adopt social and environmental practices.
Using data from the qualitative and quantitative discussions, only attitude, subjective norms, and desirability variables were deemed to be significant and positive influencers to the dependent variable, which is the successor's intent to implement sustainable business practices. Meaning successor's intent can be predicted using these three variables.
All in all, the quantitative and qualitative data analysis method yielded somewhat different results. As seen in the compiled information presented, The responses from the interview participants confirmed that the variables relate to successors' intent when using qualitative methods. On the other hand, by analyzing the quantitative data results, two variables were deemed to have little to no significance on the dependent variable. These variables are outcome expectation and the combined variable of perceived behavioral control and self-efficacy. This led to a reworking and adjustment of the original proposed framework.
With that, we can conclude that attitude and subjective norms from the theory of planned behavior and the variable desirability from social cognitive theory are the only variables that directly influence the successor's intent, while perceived behavioral control, self-efficacy, and outcome expectations are deemed to have no significance. Moreover, although all variables positively influence intention, desirability is the strongest, followed by attitude and subjective norms respectively. Overall, the results show that successors with a more positive attitude towards the behavior, stronger influence or pressure of their incumbents, and stronger desire would strengthen the successor's intent to adopt sustainable business practices.
For our recommendations, future research can use other theories such as the social cognitive career theory. This would help researchers to trace the link between successors and their career-related decisions. Future studies can also consider doing an in-depth analysis on the incumbent-successor relationships and how it affects successor intention in implementing sustainable practices in the family business. It is also recommended to study the ecological, the social, and economic factors of the business. Future studies can focus on whether certain factors have a stronger weight in relation to adopting sustainable practices. Lastly, future research can also consider focusing on a specific business industry in order to easily compare the sustainability intentions of each successor. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening.